Winter 1945 had gripped the Pacific Islands with a bitter, unrelenting cold. Snow was rare, but the damp, freezing winds that swept through the makeshift Japanese POW camps were merciless. The women huddled in tattered shacks, their bodies wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find. Thin blankets barely covered their shoulders, leaving arms and legs exposed. Every gust of wind was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how swiftly suffering could consume them. The Americans had arrived months earlier, bringing an unfamiliar order. They moved with precision, not haste, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. Rumors had spread like wildfire before the first patrols reached the camps. The Americans were cruel, merciless, and unfeeling. Mothers whispered warnings to their daughters. Sisters clasped hands tightly in fear. No one expected compassion. No one imagined mercy. Among the prisoners was Michiko, barely 19, with hair still shining despite weeks without proper washing. She had watched, silent and trembling, as her friends shivered uncontrollably, coughing and losing strength each day. When American soldiers first arrived, she noticed the blankets they carried. They were thick, well-made, the kind no Japanese village had ever seen. The first instinct of the women was to mock them. Thin American blankets, they laughed bitterly, could never survive the cold. The soldiers approached their barracks carefully, speaking softly through translators. "These are for you," said one, placing a bundle at the entrance of each shack. The women stared, eyes wide, expecting some hidden trick. Perhaps these blankets were poisoned. Perhaps they would be stolen after the women slept. Michiko's grandmother, old and frail, muttered under her breath, "It's too easy. Nothing is free from them." Night fell, and the women reluctantly accepted the blankets. They tried wrapping them around themselves, their laughter hollow and anxious. The cold seeped through, but the blankets were warm, heavier than anything they had imagined. For the first time in weeks, Michiko felt a fraction of comfort, but she remained skeptical. She did not trust the soldiers. How could enemies show kindness without cost? The nights stretched on. Each evening, more blankets were delivered. Warm water, food, even small gifts like bars of soap appeared quietly at the edge of the barracks. The soldiers never entered without announcing themselves. They stayed a measured distance away, their eyes calm but watchful. At first, the women whispered among themselves, unsure whether this was a ruse. Perhaps the kindness was a setup for humiliation, a prelude to violence. Yet slowly, hesitation gave way to curiosity. A young girl named Aiko, no older than 16, held the blanket against her face and gasped. The warmth, soft and enveloping, seemed to erase some of the fear lodged deep inside her. She hugged it close, and for the first time, she allowed herself a tiny, trembling smile. Others watched her, hesitant at first, then began imitating the gesture. Blankets became small talismans against fear. They reminded the women that the world could be gentle even amidst war. Days passed. The soldiers continued their routine, distributing necessities, providing clean water, helping the women tend to minor injuries, and retreating before they could be approached. Michiko noticed one Marine, tall and quiet, who lingered just long enough to ensure everyone received what they needed. He never spoke beyond what the translator allowed, yet there was a calm authority in his movements. He did not demand thanks, nor did he acknowledge fear. He simply acted. One night, Michiko dared to ask the translator a question she had been holding for weeks. "Why do they care?" she whispered, yet her voice trembling. The translator shook his head slightly. "I do not know," he said. "Perhaps they are simply different." Michiko could only nod. Different. Yes, the Americans were nothing like the monsters the propaganda had warned them about. They were human, and yet their humanity was strange and disorienting. The weather worsened. Rain mixed with frost, forming mud that stuck to bare feet. The women, thin and malnourished, struggled to maintain warmth. Yet every evening the soldiers arrived, blankets in hand, each bundle carefully folded and placed. The act became ritualistic, almost sacred. It was as though the very existence of mercy in a world so consumed by violence was a quiet rebellion. Michiko noticed that even the guards smiled faintly, an acknowledgement of the absurdity and beauty of it. One night, a medical officer entered the barracks, accompanied by 2 nurses. Through the translator, they announced that anyone suffering from cold or illness would receive medicine and proper care. The women froze, unsure how to react. Relief mingled with suspicion. Could this be real? Michiko watched as a nurse knelt to check a child's pulse, speaking softly and reassuringly, never touching more than necessary. The officer administered medicine and left quietly. No fanfare, no humiliation, just help. Whispers of disbelief circulated among the women. "Why do they not harm us?" Aiko asked another girl, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the air like a ghost. There were no answers, only continued acts of care, repeated nightly, that slowly eroded fear. Michiko realized that the real shock was not brutality, but the absence of it. They had prepared for abuse, yet all they encountered was patience, restraint, and dignity. Winter's nights were long and unforgiving, yet the blankets saved lives. They saved more than bodies, they saved spirits. One evening, Michiko observed the Marine who had quietly watched over them. He laid a blanket over a shivering elder woman and stepped back without a word. She looked up, expecting mockery or command, but found only calm eyes, distant yet respectful. She pressed the blanket to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks, a mixture of relief and awe. As weeks passed, the routine became the lifeline of the camp. Blankets were folded, delivered, replaced. Water was replenished. Food was handed carefully to each woman. Even small gestures, like a loaf of bread broken in 2 for a child, carried immense weight. The women began to trust, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty. The Americans' kindness became a bridge across the abyss of hatred and fear. Michiko kept a small journal in secret. Every detail was recorded: the sound of boots on frost, the weight of the blankets, the careful distribution of food. She noted how the women's laughter returned slowly, like fragile threads weaving through broken cloth. The cold remained, biting at their skin, yet the warmth of human decency created a protective cocoon, invisible yet stronger than the harshest winter winds. By the end of the month, the camp had transformed in subtle ways. The women moved with slightly straighter backs, children played quietly despite the cold, and even the silence of the night seemed less oppressive. The Marines continued their measured presence, never too close, never too distant, a living testament to restraint. Michiko realized that the war outside the camp had not ended. Bombs and battles raged elsewhere. But inside these walls, a different story was being written. One of quiet, steady humanity. The days in the camp became a rhythm, almost sacred in their simplicity. Morning light filtered through broken shutters, casting thin stripes across frost-hardened floors. The women awoke, stiff and shivering, clutching the blankets that had become their most trusted companions. Michiko had begun to measure time not by the sun, but by the arrival of the American soldiers. The rustle of boots, the gentle placing of supplies, the quiet assurance that they would not be harmed. Each day was a new test of faith, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity had not been entirely extinguished. Food arrived steadily, distributed with the same care as the blankets. Tin cups of broth, small pieces of bread, and occasionally a slab of meat that glistened under the cold sunlight. The women had never seen such provisions. The camp had its rules. No soldier entered the barracks without announcing themselves. No one touched the prisoners beyond what was necessary, and no word of malice was spoken. Michiko found herself watching the Marines closely, trying to decipher their motivations. But there was no trick, no hidden cruelty. There was only restraint. Children began to emerge from the shadows, tentative at first, rubbing eyes wide with wonder. They tugged at their mothers' skirts, hesitant to touch the blankets or food, unsure if kindness could truly exist without consequence. Aiko, braver than most, held a loaf of bread in both hands and took a small bite. The soldiers watched from a distance, indifferent to the spectacle, yet their presence was comforting. The girls began to understand that the world had shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Enemies could be human. Enemies could be careful, even gentle. Michiko's journal became a sanctuary. She wrote with charcoal on scraps of paper, detailing each small miracle. How the blankets, at first scorned, now wrapped children in warmth. How the soldiers, tall and stoic, never imposed themselves, yet ensured survival. How one morning a nurse brought brushes, soap and cloths, and let the women wash their children without interference. It was a simple act, yet it felt revolutionary. For weeks, Michiko had believed survival meant vigilance, fear, and suspicion. Now it meant trust, albeit cautious and measured. The cold intensified as January approached. Frost clung to the edges of wooden barracks, and every step outside was a test of endurance. The Americans anticipated this, leaving extra blankets and tending to fires that flared against the wind. Michiko watched as one Marine carefully laid an additional layer on an elderly woman, her hands shaking as she tried to accept it. She looked up, eyes wide with disbelief, expecting reprimand, perhaps even violence. Instead, she saw nothing but calm patience. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks, a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. Word of the soldiers' restraint began to spread among the prisoners. Whispers travelled through the barracks. They do not harm us. They leave us our dignity. Perhaps they are not like we were told. Each sentence felt fragile, as though spoken too loudly might shatter the delicate reality they now inhabited. The women began to talk in hushed tones about their former expectations, about the propaganda that had taught them to fear, about the lies of honor and shame that had governed their lives. Michiko listened, scribbling notes in her journal, aware that this was history being rewritten, quietly and without fanfare. One morning, a medical officer arrived, carrying vials of medicine and a small ledger. He knelt beside a young boy, coughing and pale, and administered syrup with a gentle hand. His presence was quiet but authoritative. There was no spectacle, no need to assert dominance. The officer moved from one prisoner to another, providing care with minimal intrusion. The women, accustomed to coercion and cruelty in wartime, stared in disbelief. It was almost too much to believe. Each act of care contradicted the countless warnings they had grown up with. By mid-January, Michiko began to notice a transformation among the women. Huddled groups, once silent and fearful, now whispered stories of their past lives, sharing memories of home, of childhood, of family meals before the war. Laughter, quiet and tentative, began to echo through the camp, almost imperceptibly at first, like a bird testing the air before flight. The blankets, warm and protective, became symbols of this new reality. No longer just fabric, they were trust, humanity, and survival woven together. One evening, as the sun dipped behind jagged peaks, Michiko observed the soldiers standing at the perimeter. They did not relax, nor did they hover. They were vigilant, yet distant, a delicate balance of authority and respect. She watched as one soldier, noticing a small child shivering in the corner, tossed an extra blanket across the floor. The child scrambled forward, clutching it to her chest. The soldier stepped back, eyes calm, and allowed the moment to exist without interference. Michiko realized then that restraint could be as powerful as force, if not more. Aiko, emboldened by the passing days, began to ask questions through the translator. "Why do you not harm us?" she asked, voice barely audible. The response was simple. "We are here to maintain order. You are prisoners, not enemies to be abused." The words seemed Ed to hover in the air, carrying a weight neither girl nor adult could fully comprehend. Michiko noted in her journal that language alone could never capture the quiet shock of mercy in a world built on fear. The soldiers also brought small comforts, pieces of fruit, rice, and occasionally items that seemed almost luxurious, a bar of chocolate, a tin of milk. Each gift was carefully measured, distributed with patience, and placed at a respectful distance. The women began to realize that their captors were rewriting the rules of engagement, not through grand declarations, but through subtle, consistent acts of decency. Michiko's heart ached with gratitude and disbelief. The world she had been taught to fear was, in these moments, strangely gentle. Winter stretched into February. The nights were long, bitterly cold, but the women endured. The blankets, once mocked, were now treasures. Michiko noticed a pattern. Each morning the soldiers arrived earlier, anticipating the harsher weather. Each night the blankets were replaced and fires stoked. The routine was predictable, yet profoundly reassuring. It was a lesson in care, discipline, and the quiet power of human decency. One day, a Marine brought a bundle of paper and pencils. Through the translator, he announced that the women could write letters to their families, to be sent via the Red Cross. The concept was almost impossible to grasp. Years of propaganda had taught them that capture meant silence, shame, and dishonor. Yet here the soldiers were offering not just survival, but communication, a lifeline to the outside world. Michiko took a pencil, trembling, and began to write. The words were simple, yet monumental. I am alive. Do not despair. We are treated with respect. The children learned quickly. They wrapped themselves in blankets, drank warm broth without fear, and played quietly under the watchful eyes of soldiers who neither intruded nor interfered. Michiko observed their laughter, noting how it returned slowly, like sunlight piercing through winter clouds. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, was an anchor in the storm of uncertainty. The soldiers' restraint had become a force of its own, shaping the women's perception of mercy, dignity, and humanity. Michiko's journal grew heavier with each passing day. She wrote about the warmth of the blankets, the taste of the first fresh bread in weeks, the careful distance of the soldiers, and the subtle acts of care that defied every expectation of captivity. Each entry was a testament to the shock of mercy, the idea that humans, even enemies, could act without malice, and that such actions could leave a deeper impression than any punishment ever could. As February waned, the women began to understand the full scope of their situation. They were prisoners, yes, but not victims of cruelty. The soldiers maintained a careful balance: authority without oppression, vigilance without intrusion, distance without neglect. Every interaction, however small, became a lesson in unexpected humanity. Michiko observed her fellow prisoner Thus, women who had entered the camp terrified, huddled in corners, eyes wide with fear, were now beginning to straighten their backs, to speak softly, to laugh quietly. The blankets, once mocked for their thinness, had become symbols of protection, of comfort, and of the strange generosity that defined this place. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered camp, a group of Marines arrived carrying sacks of fresh supplies. Each package was carefully weighed, measured, and laid down at a respectful distance. The women, skeptical at first, hesitated. No one touched the soldiers, no one questioned their motives aloud, yet their eyes followed every movement. Michiko's heart pounded as she watched an elderly woman slowly reach for a bundle of bread. The soldier did not intervene. He simply stepped back, giving her space to claim it. This quiet restraint, the refusal to assert dominance where it was not necessary, was more shocking than any act of violence could have been. The children had adapted quickly. They learned the rhythm of the camp, the arrival of food, the distribution of blankets, the careful attention of the soldiers, and the rare yet treasured moments of play. A small boy named Haruto began to experiment with a ball he had found, rolling it back and forth across the barracks floor. The soldiers watched from a distance, never intruding, their silence a form of protection. Michiko noted how the children's laughter, once silenced by fear, now filled the camp with a fragile, trembling hope. One morning a medical officer arrived, accompanied by 2 nurses. They went from prisoner to prisoner, examining the sick, administering medicine, and offering comfort. There was no rush, no brusque efficiency. Each patient was treated with care, each action deliberate and gentle. Michiko watched as one nurse knelt beside a young girl with a high fever, holding her hand and speaking softly through the translator. The girl, who had expected pain and humiliation, relaxed in the nurse's presence. Tears streamed down Michiko's face as she realized the enormity of what was happening. The enemy, the soldiers she had been taught to fear, were performing acts of compassion. The letters to families became a lifeline. Michiko wrote daily, each word a thread connecting her to a world she feared was lost. She wrote of survival, of food, of blankets, of soldiers who did not touch or harm. She wrote of hope, of the small joys that had returned to the camp, and of the strange, disorienting humanity that defined their captivity. Each letter was collected, folded, and sent via the Red Cross. The women watched as the canvas sacks disappeared over the fences, unsure if their words would ever reach their families, yet comforted by the act itself. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted, leaving muddy paths and the first hints of green. The camp, once a place of fear, had become a structured sanctuary. The soldiers' presence was constant but unobtrusive. Blankets were replaced, food distributed, fires stoked. The children grew stronger, the women more confident, and Michiko's journal swelled with observations, reflections, and the profound realization that mercy could be as transformative as violence. One afternoon, a Marine approached Michiko and a small group of women carrying a bundle of soap, brushes, and cloths. He knelt, setting the items down at a careful distance, and gestured for the women to use them. For many, it was the first chance in months to wash properly, to care for themselves and their children. Michiko dipped a brush in warm water, scrubbing her daughter's face until the grime and fatigue of weeks vanished. The child laughed, a pure, unrestrained sound that seemed to echo across the entire camp. The soldiers did not interfere, their eyes respectfully averted. Michiko realized that this simple act, the refusal to intrude, the respect for personal space, carried more weight than any command or threat ever could. Rumors began to circulate among the women. Stories of kindness, restraint, and quiet humanity spread like wildfire. "They feed us," whispered one. "They do not touch us," said another. "Perhaps the world is not entirely cruel," murmured a third. Each statement was fragile yet powerful, challenging everything they had been taught to believe. Michiko watched as skepticism gradually gave way to cautious trust. The women began to move more freely, to speak softly to one another, to embrace the small joys of survival. Violence, but by the absence of it. Soldiers patrolled, yes, but always with respect, always maintaining distance. Food, water, and blankets arrived daily. Medical care was provided, letters sent, and the children played under careful supervision. Michiko recorded everything, knowing that this story, the story of mercy, restraint, and humanity amidst war, would need to be told. One day, a nurse approached with a small child in her arms, a boy who had been too weak to stand. She handed him to his mother, who embraced him tightly, tears streaming down her face. The soldier stood nearby, silent, allowing the reunion to unfold without interference. Michiko wrote in her journal, "The shock is not cruelty, but the absence of it. In a world built on fear, restraint becomes the most powerful act of all." As summer approached, news of Japan's surrender reached the camp. The women whispered among themselves, uncertain of what this would mean. Release orders came slowly, systematically. Soldiers continued their routine, food, blankets, medical care, until the day arrived for the women to board the boats home. Michiko observed the scene with a mixture of apprehension and relief. The soldiers had given them survival, dignity, and trust. Now it was time to leave, carrying memories that would challenge every expectation of cruelty they had ever known. On the docks, women clutched small bundles, blankets, scraps of cloth, letters, tokens of their time in captivity. Michiko held her journal tightly, knowing that every word written would serve as a testament to the quiet, powerful humanity they had witnessed. The soldiers stood at the perimeter, rifles lowered, eyes respectful. No one touched, no one demanded, no one violated. It was the final act of restraint, the ultimate demonstration that mercy could endure even in the harshest of circumstances. As the boats pulled away, Hiko looked back at the camp. The soldiers, exhausted and weathered, continued their watch. They had not acted as enemies, but as caretakers, guardians, and witnesses to a fragile humanity. Michiko whispered a prayer, not for revenge or justice, but for understanding. Understanding that in a world ravaged by war, acts of mercy could leave scars as deep and memories as lasting as any battle ever fought. Years later, as Michiko recounted her experiences to her daughters, she emphasized a single truth. The greatest shock of captivity was not cruelty, but kindness. The blankets, the food, the careful distance, the letters. Each act defied expectation and left an indelible mark on her soul. She explained that the soldiers' restraint had reshaped her understanding of the world, proving that even enemies could embody dignity, respect, and humanity. The story of the Japanese women in that Pacific camp, though largely forgotten, remains a testament to the quiet power of compassion. In a war defined by violence, destruction, and loss, it was the absence of cruelty, the careful, deliberate restraint of those with power, that became the most astonishing, transformative experience of all. Michiko's final journal entry read, "We entered the camp expecting horror, humiliation, and despair. Instead, we found blankets, food, and hands that did not touch us. We were prisoners, yes, but not victims. And in that truth, we discovered a mercy more terrifying and more beautiful than anything we could have imagined."